John 6:29. Respondit Iesus et dixit eis, hoc est opus Dei, ut credatis in eum, quem misit ille. Jesus answered and said to them, This is the work of God, that you believe in him whom he has sent. Here Jesus is continuing his conversation with the crowds who are asking him pressing questions related to the central meaning of his message. It's a very interesting conversation so far. And first of all, we have our typical words of response. Jesus is answering and speaking to them. First thing we might note here is that in just the last verse, we had, when the crowd was speaking, dixerunt ad eum. We remarked on how that is sort of an unusual thing to see, even in the Vulgate. Ad, the preposition, plus the accusative of the pronoun for what is more or less expressing an indirect object. Much more usually we see the dative as here in this example. But that just goes to show you there's unexpected variations in the Vulgate, and they're not always predictable. That's part of the fun of reading the Vulgate. Now, in Jesus's actual speech, which I've marked here with quotation marks, so he answered them and he said, he begins with, this is what it is. Because they had asked him in the last verse, the crowds that is, what works ought we to work in order to please God? And so he says, hoc est opus Dei. This is the work of God that you are to do. And then what follows is what we call a substantive clause or a noun clause. Now, it also has a relative clause embedded within it here, but you see these all over the place in Latin. There's many different types, and if you're not exactly sure what a substantive clause is, this is a really good thing to look up in your grammar of choice because they occur so frequently. They're just good to be able to recognize. Even if you can translate and read and understand what you're seeing without much trouble, it's good to know what they're called, of course. So Jesus is saying, this is the work of God. And then in English, we would kind of say in our minds here, namely, what's about to follow. So all of the stuff that I've bracketed in the yellow highlighter here is really just defining hoc, which in turn is opus Dei, right? Jesus is telling us this is really what it is. It's as though we have an equal sign here. So in a sense, this whole clause from ut to illa is just defining hoc in apposition, saying this is what it is, namely, here's another way of saying the work of God. But it's expressed with an ut and a verb in the subjunctive, in this case, the present subjunctive. You can think again of that mnemonic device, we fear a liar. Here, credo, credere, third conjugation verb, is that a in the present subjunctive, in we fear a liar. So very often, substantive clauses like this and of various other kinds will take a verb in the subjunctive. That's nothing unusual. Here's how we would translate it into English if we needed to translate it into English. Again, I like to emphasize that our ultimate goal with Latin should be simply reading and comprehending the Latin. That is learning to think in Latin without the English middleman. But in the course of these videos, we want to spell things out and make them super clear as possible. So we're going to use English to do that. And we're going to perform this complicated operation that we call translation, which actually in some senses is much harder than simply just reading and understanding the Latin, because sometimes English and Latin are incommensurate, right? There isn't really a one-to-one correspondence. In fact, that's usually the case. Anyway, I digress. Hoc est opus Dei. This is the work of God, namely, this thing that I'm about to say with this ut clause, that you all, notice that this is a plural ending, you all believe, and we might expect in eo, but that's not what we get. We get in eum with the accusative case. This is a bit of an unusual construction, but it's reflecting underlying Greek, as so often in the Greek New Testament. In English, we would probably simply say believe in him rather than believe upon him or something, which would be unidiomatic in English, at least outside of the life and world of the church, where that has become sort of idiomatic. But in regular everyday English speak, that's not how English language, that's not how we speak. And then we get our really short relative clause, believe in him whom ille, and this is God the Father, Deus, who's just sort of been referenced here, whom he, and I think, again, this is more or less just equivalent to is, whom he, God the Father, has sent. Notice that this is third person singular, perfect, active, indicative from mitto, mittere.